There's growing support for a push to bring passenger rail lines to Wilmington. A new study shows ridership is breaking records on existing routes in North Carolina and a $20 billion boost to the economy when you include freight trains. WECT's Marmac Jolton spoke to NCDOT's Rail Division director about how it could impact us here in southeastern North Carolina.
Jason Orthner tells me that passenger rail is actually one of the safest modes of transportation, but this growth also has a focus on expanding freight trains for places like the port to help take some of those loads off of the roads. Orthner says they've seen passenger rail lines support economic development in other parts of the state by adding different retail and commercial developments near those train stations. He also says having a passenger rail line would likely attract more tourists each year. And by growing both freight and passenger lines, he says it would help reduce the number of cars and trucks on our roadways, cutting down on traffic and toxic emissions. Orthner says he hopes to bring this passenger line to Wilmington in the near future to help connect more of the rural towns in between Wilmington and Raleigh.
It's a really important component of driving economic development, of making sure our commerce is flowing freely in our state, that we're supporting our manufacturing centers and other businesses, and that we're reducing the burden on our highway system, to handle heavy loads and also our increasing and growing passenger rail component as well.
Now, Orthner says this project is on the horizon for being funded, and realistically, once the project is fully funded, it could take anywhere from 7 to 12 years to build that rail line and get that train in service. Marmac Jolton, WECT News.